Hello and welcome to our third and final briefing in our series, What Congress Needs to Know About COP28. Today, our subject is the first Global Stocktake. I'm Dan Brissett, the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. Founded by a bipartisan group of members of Congress, EESI has worked since 1984 to provide science-based information about environmental, energy, and climate change topics to policymakers and the public. That means we do a lot of briefings like this today. Some are in person, some like today, only online. But we do briefings on as many different climate change topics as we can possibly fit into a given calendar year. For example, earlier this year, we focused on agriculture policy with our eye on the Farm Bill. And now, more recently, we've turned our attention to the upcoming United Nations climate negotiations in Dubai, formerly known or alternatively known as COP28. Everything we do is always available online at www.eesi.org. I also encourage everyone who would like to keep up with our work to subscribe to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. In fact, tomorrow is the next issue of Climate Change Solutions, and you wouldn't want to miss that. It's a really, really good one. Timely, relevant, accessible, and practical. Those are the qualities that we want all of our policymaker educational resources to have. We put a lot of thought into our resources to always be science-based and ready when congressional staff need the information. For example, when staff need resources to help prepare for or watch the Energy and Commerce COP28 hearing on Wednesday, we hope that you'll use our resources as a resource to get up to speed very quickly. We also have dozens of legislative side-by-side comparison fact sheets for Farm Bill programs already posted. They're ready to be updated as soon as House and Senate text become available. We also have articles, podcasts, fact sheets, issue briefs, a whole wide range of resources. It's always much better to have this information before you need it, before your boss asks a tough question about a climate change topic on a Thursday afternoon. You can count on us to always help with that. And to help Congress follow developments at the UN climate negotiations set to start later this week, we have a lot of really excellent resources to look out for. In addition to our briefing today, we've also taken a look at issues of international climate finance, and we provided an overview of what we expect to be on the table in Dubai. My colleague Anna McGinn and I will be EESI's boots on the ground in Dubai, and together with our policy and communications teams, we will be running an extensive, extremely impressive set of programming. First, every day during COP28, we will publish a daily newsletter called COP Dispatch. If you've not already subscribed at eesi.org/signup, this is an online briefing, and so I won't be offended one bit if you take on a little multitasking to rectify that post-haste and sign up. You really won't want to miss that. It's a really excellent newsletter. Great way to keep everyone up to date with things from a congressional perspective. Second, we'll have events in Dubai, including an official UN side event about the science behind carbon markets on December 3rd, as well as 2 press conferences that will feature speakers who can comment on the proceedings. And lastly, if you're a congressional staff person, you should also already be aware of additional staff-only resources. Feel free to contact me or my colleague Anna if you have not, or if you have any questions about anything like that. The first global stocktake refers to a process established by the Paris Agreement, which aims to assess the world's collective progress toward the goal of keeping global average temperature rise well below 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or as it's commonly said, 2 degrees Celsius. For more than a year, government representatives and non-governmental stakeholders from around the world have contributed to this process. There are very important implications of the global stocktake for greenhouse gas emission reductions and climate adaptation in the United States and abroad. The global stocktake will also take place in the wake of the release of the authoritative 5th National Climate Assessment, which was just released on November 14th. This report absolutely demands the attention of Congress. There are signs of progress for sure, but unfortunately not at the scope, scale, or pace necessary to achieve the U.S. goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2030. And the report also makes it crystal clear that our resolve to adapt to climate impacts and help communities improve their resilience is just plainly insufficient. We will be doing a deep dive into the National Climate Assessment, or NCA5 as it's abbreviated, in our first briefing of 2024 on January 18th. So I encourage everyone to sign up to attend to learn more about all of that. My colleague is going to put a quick slide up here with a link to our survey. We'll also come back to this at the end of the briefing, but in case you have to drop off before the 90-minute mark, if you have a moment to let us know how we're doing, if you have any feedback you'd like to share, this is the link to do it. We read every response and we take this very seriously. So if there are any suggestions or audio problems or video problems or anything like that, I hope you'll take a moment to fill out the survey to let us know. Before I introduce our 4 panelists, we are joined virtually by a very special guest. Representative Kathy Castor was first elected to serve in Congress in 2006. Today, she represents the people of Florida's 14th Congressional District and serves on the powerful Energy and Commerce Committee, as well as the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. In the 2 previous Congresses, Representative Castor chaired the former House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, which was an important leadership position to push bold action to solve the climate crisis and its escalating impacts on communities in Florida and across the nation. Representative Castor, thank you for agreeing to join us today. I really appreciate all the hard work on your part and on your staff part to make this possible. I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Kathy Castor of Florida. I'm the former chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Thanks to the Environmental and Energy Study Institute for the opportunity to open this discussion about the United Nations COP28, the Conference of Parties, and the first global stocktake on the world's progress to solve the climate crisis. Climate conferences allow leaders across the U.S. and nonprofits and the private sector to influence international climate policy. And COP28 is no different. So I appreciate the Institute hosting this event series to help us set the table. The first global stocktake since the Paris Agreement of 2015 is expected to drive this year's discussions in Dubai. An early look at the stocktake's findings indicates that the nations across the globe are not on track to achieve the Paris Agreement's objectives, including the overriding goal to keep a limit on warming. The threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius is the threshold beyond which scientists say it will be increasingly hard for humans to avoid the worst impacts of the heating planet. The planet is already warmed about 1.2 degrees Celsius, and emissions that are driving up the change are also going up and not down. So we need to fight to reduce pollution and do so with accountability. According to the 5th National Climate Assessment released just last month, the impacts of human-caused climate change are already far-reaching and worsening across every region of the United States. Rapidly reducing greenhouse gas pollution can limit future warming and associated increases in many risks. And while efforts to adapt and reduce pollution have expanded since 2018, and U.S. emissions have fallen since 2007, without deeper cuts in global greenhouse gas pollution and accelerated adaptation, severe climate risks will continue to grow. Each increment of warming that the world avoids through actions that cut pollution or remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere reduces the risks and harmful impacts of climate change. Here in Florida, we just lived through the hottest year on record. It was oppressively hot and dry, and some coastal waters reached temperatures exceeding 101 degrees. It's like a jacuzzi. People are ready to act to protect our way of life. And while I know that the climate extremes and the higher cost and harm to frontline communities can feel overwhelming and discouraging, we also have reasons to hope. In 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed, UN scientists believed that we were headed for an apocalyptic 3.6 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. But fortunately, we've since shaved off a full degree from that trajectory, thanks to the plummeting costs of clean energy. 8 years ago, solar and wind power were more expensive than fossil fuels. Now they're the cheapest sources of energy. Electric cars and trucks, too, are less expensive than gas over their lifetime and will soon be even cheaper to buy up front. The International Energy Agency now projects that global consumption of fossil fuels will peak this decade. Plus, the Inflation Reduction Act is another reason to feel bullish about climate action. I was so proud to stand on the stage with President Biden as he signed into law the largest investment in clean energy and climate resilience in our history. And America's climate law is the envy of the world because it's cutting the cost of energy, it's creating jobs, so many that it's difficult to keep up with the announcements of new factories all across America. So I'm proud that we can tout American progress at COP28 while we push to go farther and faster. The Stocktake findings make that clear that we do not have time to waste. So thanks again. I look forward to the excellent panel as we work together to meet our moral obligation to our kids and future generations to solve the climate crisis.
That was great. Thank you, Representative Castor, for joining us today and sharing your thoughts about the global stocktake, as well as the status of efforts to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions or mitigate global warming and also help communities adapt and become more resilient. And thanks to your staff for making your participation possible as well. Now it is time for our panel. We have 4 tremendous panelists lined up. And after the 4th presentation, we'll have a few moments for questions, hopefully several moments for questions. If you have a question in our online audience, if you have a question, you have 2 options for sending it to us. One, you can follow us on social media at EESI Online. We will be live tweeting the event on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter. But you could also send us an email, and the email address to use is ask, that's ASK, at eesi.org. We'll do our best to get to your question or incorporate or find a way to incorporate it somehow into the discussion. And that leads us to our first of 4 panelists. Hannah Roeyer serves as lead for the Independent Global Stocktake, or IGST, network. The IGST is a global consortium connecting researchers, advocates, and practitioners working in support of an impactful first global stocktake. Previously, Hannah led the philanthropic data analysis program at Climateworks Foundation, and across her career has worked with governments, NGOs, and foundations to deploy data-driven strategies for the public interest. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here today. As Daniel said, my name is Hannah Roeyer, and I'm here representing the Independent Global Stocktake Network, or the IGST. I work for the Secretariat of the IGST based out of Climateworks Foundation in San Francisco. As I'm the first presenter today, I'm going to share some basic background on the Global Stocktake as a foundation for the rest of the panel, which will go more into depth on some of the specifics. As Daniel was saying, the organization I work with, the IGST, is a civil society network that has been working together over the past few years to support a robust first ever global stocktake. We have partners based across the world, evenly distributed in the global north and global south, and with representatives based in all the major climate negotiating blocs. Our consortium collaborates on research and advocacy to strengthen the stocktake and ultimately empower countries to take greater climate action. So when countries signed on to the Paris Agreement, they made a collective commitment to 3 long-term goals under Article 2 of the agreement: to limit temperature change to well below 2 and ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius, to build out climate resilience and adaptation, and to transform our financial systems to enable these transitions. Well, the Paris Agreement also contains other provisions you've probably heard of. The Global Stocktake's main purpose is to evaluate progress towards these 3 long-term goals, as well as 2 related items, loss and damage and response measures. So back in 2015, the Paris Agreement also set up the bottom-up process of countries submitting what are called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, to outline plans for national climate action. At the time the agreement was signed, countries acknowledged that their collective national commitments were not yet strong enough to achieve these 3 goals. And so they built in this new mechanism known as the ratcheting cycle that you can see on this slide here, which is a repeating 5-year cycle designed to continually ratchet up climate ambition and implementation over time. The Global Stocktake can be thought of as the accountability engine, or sometimes called the heartbeat behind this cycle. And so every 5 years, with the first one culminating this year, the global community comes together under the banner of the stocktake to look at progress towards our climate goals and to figure out what needs to happen to course correct in the event we're not on track. And I'll give you a little spoiler alert, we are in fact not on track. But the beauty of the ratcheting cycle is then the findings from this global stocktake then come back around, feed into the next round of NDCs. And the basic idea is that we can use the information about where we're off track and what needs to change to get on track to support a collective roadmap for the next decade. So just to take you through the whole cycle, we're looking at updated NDCs submitted every 5 years, 2020, 2025, et cetera. Then countries work on the implementation of these pledges. There's a process to report back. And then this information, along with other climate science, is assessed through the stocktake. And that comes back around and feeds into, informs the next round of NDCs about where they really need to concentrate their accelerated action. So the first stocktake's happening this year and will happen again in 2028, 2033, and so on. This year's stocktake is going to inform NDCs that will be submitted in 2025, laying out planned climate action for the following decade through to 2035. So while the first stocktake is mostly complete, the road from now through COP30, which will be in 2025 in Brazil, is also quite important and can kind of all be thought of along the same continuum. One more note on the process itself, just because the name of the stocktake can indicate it's just a technical report or just backward looking, but it was intentionally designed to be a multi-phase process with both technical components and also importantly, significant political components. Sometimes that can get lost when we discuss it. The slide here lays out the timeline for this first stocktake. So it actually kicked off nearly 2 years ago. And there's already been a long process of gathering input from various sources to inform the assessment, as well as a series of technical dialogues to solicit expert input and ensure all parties have the opportunity to share their views. So this 18-month technical phase of the stocktake wrapped up just a few months ago in September with a major report called the Technical Synthesis Report, which provides the scientific findings of the stocktake. And while politics did, of course, sneak in here and there, the idea of the technical meetings and report is that it was purely technical and not a negotiated text. We are now here in the green on this slide in the political phase, where the baton has passed from the technical experts to the negotiators who are working on negotiations around how to respond to the technical findings of the stocktake with political messaging and high-level commitments. And in terms of what we can expect at COP28, the stocktake is being set up as more or less the flagship agenda item. There are a number of other important things on the docket, but the stocktake is the only thing on the agenda that is mandated to span all thematic areas. It even, for instance, got a fair amount of airtime in the recent Biden-Xi climate statement coming out of APEC. And given its broad thematic coverage and the general agreement among parties so far that it should be both backward-looking and forward-looking, meaning that it's not just a backward-looking assessment of where we have been and where we've fallen short, but also needs to provide forward-looking recommendations about where we need to go, there's really a huge amount of latitude for what a negotiated decision text around the stocktake could contain at COP28. As the IGST, it's our sense that the more forward-looking it can be and the more countries can capitalize on this moment to agree on new joint commitments that meaningfully move the needle on climate, the better it will be for all of us. But I'll come back to the political piece in a moment. First, I'll share just a few words about what the technical report contained. I won't spend very long here, as I believe my fellow panelists will dig deeper into this. But in short, really no major surprises. The report had 17 key findings spanning the thematic areas. So mitigation, adaptation, finance, which are the 3 long-term goals, again, of the Paris Agreement, as well as on cross-cutting findings. One thing the report did find is that the Paris Agreement is working, although we, of course, still have a long way to go. In 2010, we were looking at likely global temperature increase of up to 4.8 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Thankfully, today, we're closer to a mid 2 degrees projection, but to be clear, that's still a catastrophic level of temperature rise. The report, unfortunately, did find that we are off track across all the major goals assessed. We are not lowering emissions fast enough. We are not adapting fast enough. The more slowly we lower emissions, the more adaptation is going to be needed. And the slower we go, the more money we need to find to finance all of this. The report also found that we're facing both ambition gaps, so a gap between stated pledges and what's actually needed, then also implementation gaps between actual implemented policies and regulation and those higher level pledges. So we also have to pivot further towards implementation, which requires a bigger focus on credible data and accountability behind that. And then finally, I'll just mention, as part of its cross-cutting findings, the report underscored the importance of just transitions and economic diversification, which is something we heard a lot during the technical assessment, especially from countries that are still pursuing their sustainable development pathways as well as climate action at the same time. It's really important to be able to pursue those in an equitable way. So moving from the technical to the political, given that COP28 caps off this political phase and knowing what the technical report found, what do we think a GST decision at COP28 could deliver? On this slide, we have a civil society perspective from the iGST network, just to give you a more concrete sense of the kinds of things that different coalitions are pushing for. I'll say this is an ambitious list, but we really are hearing strong political signals on the use of the stocktake as a moment for comprehensive course correction. The way this will actually play out at COP is first through a series of leader level events the first week, so this coming week, where we'll get the latest official positions from countries, and then that will move into more direct negotiations, culminating, as far as we know, in a final decision text towards the end of COP28. We do have a sense of what the potential landing zones for negotiated outcomes are via some workshops and written submissions that have already been shared. Of course, geopolitics is moving quickly, and where the GST lands will also be dependent on where other things at COP28 land and the interplay between, for instance, negotiations around the global goal on adaptation, loss and damage fund, some other things like that. As I'm coming toward the end of my time, I'll just tick through these example outcomes here, and we can come back to them later in the discussion if of interest. So as civil society, here are some of the things we're asking for. Foremost, we need to ensure a clear follow-through plan for the commitments coming out of any GST agreements at COP. The next round of NDCs is one of the main places this follow-through will land, and these NDCs should move closer to 1.5 degree alignment, among other things. Second, there's good momentum behind an agreement to at least triple renewable energy capacity by 2030. This is a necessary step to be able to then phase out fossil fuels without a reduction in energy services, and the GST is looking like the most likely landing place for this energy package. Next, we've got to scale up our adaptation response, and I know Jeffrey will talk to us more about that piece, but we see this in particular through improvements in planning, as well as making sure the right kinds of finance are available to the right audiences. Also at COP28, we hope to move the needle on agreements around food systems transformations that protect people and ecosystems, and there is good movement here with the COP presidency keeping a central place for this in their agenda. We then, of course, need to scale up and shift finance in pursuit of all of these goals. Finance includes a few major buckets, including links to negotiations, which conclude next year on a new climate finance goal, regulatory measures to better align private finance, scaling and shifting public finance, and continuation of work on IFI reform that's been going on this year. And then finally, as I touched on in the last slide, this is a critical moment to launch improved data, transparency, and accountability mechanisms for non-state actors and countries. Obviously, there's a lot more to unpack under each of these, but even if just high-level signals were agreed on at COP, that would support further policymaking in the subsequent years and at the national level. So this is my last slide, and before handing off, I'll close with a few reflections on what comes after COP28. As I've said, the clearest path for GST follow-up will be as these high-level commitments are translated into national policy via the next round of NDCs and related national communications. There will also likely be outcomes that land within the UNFCCC itself, such as follow-up work programs on ironing out just exactly how things like enhanced accountability mechanisms might operate. The independent community, such as folks like myself, will continue to work to close data and methodological gaps to support future assessments. For instance, how do we really know if private finance flows are climate aligned? What counts? How do we measure this? The US will undoubtedly have a role, of course, in its own domestic policy making, but also in diplomacy and action to support these new initiatives internationally. And then we will be right back here for GST2 as part of the ongoing ratcheting cycle. So that will kick off in late 2026, early 2027, and culminate at the COP in 2028. And there's a lot more we could unpack here, but I'll go ahead and close there and pass to my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Hannah. That was an awesome presentation. Perfect way to get us started today. Hannah, you had great slides. Just as a quick reminder, in addition to the live cast or the webcast being posted on our website, which is www.eesi.org, you can also visit our website for presentation materials and eventually summary notes. So if you want to go back and revisit anything in Hannah's slides, we try to make that as easy as possible. That brings us to our second panelist of the day. Anne Olhoff is the International Senior Advisor in CONCITO. I hope I'm saying that correctly. I know that it's a Latin phrase. I'll let you, or at least based on a Latin phrase, I'll let you share that with our audience. But CONCITO is Denmark's green think tank. Anne brings more than 20 years of experience in international policy advice, technical assistance, and research on climate change mitigation and adaptation in the context of sustainable development. Since 2012, Anne has been heavily involved in managing, authoring, editing, and outreach for the annual UN Environment Program flagship report on climate change, the Emissions Gap Report. And that involves guiding and coordinating the work of more than 60 scientists from more than 35 institutions across 20 countries. Anne, welcome to our briefing today. I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. And before sharing my screen and showing you some slides, I'm going to give you a very short run through of some of the key findings of this year's UNEP Emissions Gap Report. I just wanted to share a little bit of background in terms of how does this Emissions Gap Report and Adaptation Gap Report, the two flagship reports on climate change produced every year by UNEP, how do they fit into the Global Stocktake? And you can say that actually these reports are like mini Global Stocktakes coming out every year. So the Emissions Gap Report, every year it looks into where our country climate pledges taking us, and where do we need to be according to science to have a likely chance of limiting global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees. And the Adaptation Gap Report looks into three key areas that are important to increasing resilience, reducing vulnerability, and increasing adaptive capacity. It looks into how are we doing in terms of planning for adaptation, how are we doing in terms of financing of adaptation, and how are we doing in terms of implementing adaptation. And these two reports came out recently. The Emissions Gap Report came out last Monday, and the Adaptation Gap Report came out on the 2nd of November. And so you can say that they're basically coming out every year in advance of these climate negotiations to inform the discussions, hopefully, and to help prepare for good discussions. And they also are forward-looking in terms of how can we bridge these gaps, both on the emission side and the adaptation side. So how has the global community been preparing for the Global Stocktake? Well, Hannah already gave us a nice overview of a lot of the things that's been going on in the whole process. I'm not going to go into this, but of course, this Emissions Gap Report and the Adaptation Gap Report are only two of many reports that come out annually. And at the very end of my slide deck, I included some links to some of the interesting reports that have been coming out. So we have, for instance, the Climate Action Tracker, which is providing more of a normative view also in terms of how well or unwell countries are doing, how much they are off track or on track in certain areas. We've seen the International Energy Agency just came out with an updated net zero roadmap. We have the World Energy Outlook. We have State of Climate Action and so forth. So there's like a whole multitude of reports coming out that can help give a fuller picture in various areas of how we're faring in terms of being on track or off track to the Paris Agreement goals. But I'm now going to try and see if I can share my screen and walk you through some of the key findings of UNEP's emissions gap report from this year. Let me know if it looks weird. Oh, if everything is okay. So now I just need to see how.
Looks great.
Great, thanks. So this is actually the 14th emissions gap report, looking into this gap between where country pledges are taking us and where we need to be according to science to have a likely chance of limiting global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees. And this year the report is titled Broken Record, and it's definitely come out in a year full of broken records, and it also comes out just before the concluding discussions under the first Global Stocktake of the Paris Agreement. And so, of course, we've been focusing a lot on some of the issues that we thought it would be helpful to illuminate and shed light on that can hopefully also inform the discussions under the Global Stocktake. So let's look at global greenhouse gas emissions first. What we see here is that global greenhouse gas emissions increased by 1.2% from 2021 to 2022, reaching a new record level of 57.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. We also see that by now all sectors apart from transport have fully rebounded from the drop in emissions induced by COVID-19 and now exceed the previous high level of 2019. In terms of progress since COP27, there's been very limited progress. Every year there's a call for countries to revisit and strengthen their 2030 targets, and this year only 9 countries actually responded to that call, and if fully implemented, it's only estimated to reduce global emissions in 2030 by about 0.1 gigatons of CO2 equivalents annually. However, and as we also heard from the previous speakers, there has been some progress since the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. We have seen strengthened pledges from countries, and if fully implemented, these new and updated pledges are going to result in annual reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions of about 5 gigatons CO2 equivalents by 2030 compared with the initial climate pledges, the initial nationally determined contributions. We also see that the NDCs themselves have evolved. More of them include greenhouse gas emissions targets. They have greater coverage of sectors and gases, and more now include unconditional elements. However, that's been insufficient to narrow the emissions gap in 2030, which remains high. And here you can see the different scenarios we assess. We have one on current policies, where that will take us in terms of emissions. Then we look at the so-called unconditional nationally determined contributions. We look at the conditional national determined contributions, and then we compare with what science tells us where we need to be in terms of global emissions to get on track for reaching achieving the Paris Agreement goals. And as we can see from this slide, the continuation of unconditional NDC scenarios are assessed to result in a gap with respect to a 2-degree pathway of 14 gigatons of CO2 equivalents and of 22 gigatons of CO2 equivalents with respect to a 1.5-degree pathway. If, in addition, the conditional NDCs are fully implemented, these gaps are reduced by about 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. So that's in 2030, but let's now look at 2035, because one of the important elements and what we're hoping will come out of the discussions on the conclusion of the Global Stocktake is exactly as Hannah also said, pointing forward. How do we address these gaps? How do we move forward in a good way? And one of the things that countries need to start preparing for is that in less than 2 years from now, countries are requested to submit the next round of nationally determined contributions, and these should include targets on emissions reductions for 2035. And as we can see from this slide, if we just continue along the same scenarios here and just continue the same level of climate efforts that are implied by them, these gaps will increase by 2035. So where do we need to be in 2035? What is sort of the magic number that the next round of NDCs should look at? And basically, global ambition in the next round of NDCs should be sufficient to cut off 18 gigatons compared with the current pledges, climate pledges for 2030 for a 2-degree goal and 29 gigatons of CO2 equivalents if we are to get on track for a 1.5-degree goal. So that's basically more than half of the current global greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, if we just continue over the century, these things will become worse. And that also means that we are on track for global warming that goes far beyond the Paris Agreement goal. If we continue the level of climate effort implied by current policies, we assess that we will only be limiting global warming to 2 to 3 degrees Celsius over the course of the century. And the current climate pledges for 2030 and a continuation of those would limit global warming to somewhere between 2.5 degrees and 2.9 degrees Celsius over this century. And I should say here that this is with a 66% chance. So you heard lower numbers before, but that's because most assessments out there only give a 50-50 chance for achieving the goal. And as we also see from this slide, it's only in the case, the most optimistic case that we had included in this year's emissions gap report, where we both assume that all the conditional NDCs are fully implemented and also all the net zero emission pledges that countries have put forward are fully implemented. Then we get to ranges that are closer to the Paris Agreement goal, 2 degrees Celsius over the course of the century. So what does this imply? It basically implies that the focus in this decade needs to be on relentlessly strengthening implementation. That will narrow the emissions gap in 2030. It will facilitate much more ambitious targets for 2035 in the next round of climate pledges, and it will help pave the way for enhancing the credibility and the feasibility of the net zero emission pledges that countries have put forward and that by now cover 80% of global emissions. At the current level, we don't assess the feasibility and credibility of the net zero emission pledges in general to be very high, and that's because we see that many of them are not yet in legislation. Many do not have clear implementation plans attached, and in many cases, emissions are still increasing rather than having peaked and rapidly decreasing afterwards. We're hopeful because we have seen that climate policies have had an effect. If we look back at the time of the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015, our projections under the current policies was that emissions in 2030 would be 16% higher than in 2015, and now that increase is 3%. So we do know that it's helping, but we need to have to speed it up. Speed and scale is basically of essence. And basically, we know that if we end up in 2030 at emission levels globally that are in line with those implied by the current nationally determined contributions, the current climate targets, then we can no longer establish a pathway to 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot. And it would also strongly increase the challenge of limiting warming to 2 degrees. In the interest of time, I haven't included, we also include chapters looking into how do we then facilitate energy transitions also in low and middle income countries that by now account for more than 2/3 of global emissions. And we have a chapter looking into carbon dioxide removal that will be needed and more and more as we move further into this century. But I will end here for now and hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That was a really great presentation, and I really, really appreciate that. I really like the graphic behind you, the broken record graphic. It's very impressive. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll come back to you for sure when we get to our Q&A session. Our third panelist of the day is Nate Hultman. Nate is the founder and director of the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland and professor in the School of Public Policy. Nate's work focuses on setting and achieving ambitious national climate goals. He was recently senior advisor to the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate at the U.S. Department of State, John Kerry, and he served for 2 years in the Obama White House. Nate helped develop the U.S. 2025 Nationally Determined Contribution and led the writing for the 2021 U.S. long-term strategy under the Paris Agreement. Nate has participated in the U.S. climate process for over 25 years, and not that it's a not that it's a competition, but he's attended 20 COPs, which is 10 times the COPs that I'm about to attend. So lots and lots of experience. Nate, it's great to see you again. Thanks for joining us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Daniel and EESI for organizing. Thanks, everybody, for being here to learn about this, I think, critically important topic, not only the COP, but also the stock take. And I want to just give another acknowledgement and lift up these previous two presentations, which were, I think, really fantastic at really framing up the logic of what a stock take is and does, and that Hannah did, and also to Anne for both long-term excellent work doing, is like she said, kind of annual stock takes, which I think are very valuable and worth tracking over time, by the way, but also giving us a really good insight into what's kind of happening now and what needs to be done. So real quick before I start, so Daniel gave me a great intro here, so I won't belabor any of that. I will say just a brief note for those of you who don't know the Center for Global Sustainability. We are a university-based research center at the University of Maryland, founded to support the cycle of ambition and implementation under Paris after the Paris Agreement was concluded, and I got back after serving in Obama White House for a couple of years. We're about 8 miles from the Capitol building, and so not far from where you all work. We're about 60 people working on a diverse set of topics, but primarily thinking about how subnational and national actions can serve to deliver on that increased ambition and implementation that Anne told us about a few minutes ago, and do a lot of work with not only international, but also with U.S. Target setting and delivery, both at national and also subnational levels, including with our states and cities here in the U.S. So thanks for the invitation. And let me take the opportunity then to go to the presentation. You should be able to see this. And so my job today, and I'm actually quite relieved that the previous two presentations really did a lot of a good heavy lifting for us as a group thinking about this. So my job today is to focus in a little bit on how the global stocktake is informing us about what we could call the mitigation side of climate action. And those of you who are specialists know that mitigation often just refers to reducing the emissions that cause climate change. And so we'll focus in on that. There are many other goals of climate policy in the U.S. and internationally, some of which flow directly from reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but some of which are important and complementary and worth doing in their own rights. And we'll hear more about adaptation in the next presentation. But there are several other areas on the international agenda that you might be following from time to time. And I'll, if I can, touch on those just super briefly, but more just to cue them up. So what I'm kind of thinking makes sense given the two previous presentations is to just kind of give the official version. So as Hannah told us, the global stocktake is this kind of, it's embedded in Paris. Paris calls on the global community to do this thing. And this thing has been kind of unfolding for the last couple of years, including, some work from our own, U.S. State Department and other stakeholders from outside the government engaging with that. We might talk about that more in Q&A if people are interested. But this figure here is the kind of one of the core figures that came out of one of the elements of this global stocktake, which is called the technical dialogue of the first global stocktake. And the work that Anne presented is similar to this. It's a different kind of set of activities that went into her excellent report and delivery of that report in a few minutes ago. But this is another way to look at sort of globally our overall trajectory. So this is work that the global stocktake is essentially facilitated. And let me just kind of narrate how I see this figure for you. Other people may have different views on it, but this is kind of what I see in this figure. So ultimately, as we've heard, I think a couple of times already today, the key question of the global stocktake is, we've had now give or take, 7-ish years or so after the Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement remains, in my view, and I think many other people's view, but certainly in my view, the best architecture that we have, and probably the best architecture that we will ever get to organize ourselves internationally to address the climate crisis. So we did well with Paris, but Paris cannot do everything itself. It is an organizing architecture. And within that organizing architecture, countries particularly have to step up and to sort of say within their own domestic contexts what they're going to do. And then there's this kind of process, it's sort of semi-organized, of countries kind of looking at each other and then seeing if they're ambitious enough and getting feedback from their domestic stakeholders, maybe even international friends or others, giving them sort of feedback about where their targets are going and what they should do more. And then in the domestic context, each country then formulates its response and how to do that. And we've done that in the US, and I think we've done it really well. And I would be happy to talk more about that later. We're probably in the best position we have ever been in globally with respect to domestic action in the United States that I can remember. And as you heard, I've been doing this a lot since Kyoto. And yes, I will say, like Anne's title, it sometimes does feel like a broken record in a different way. But ultimately now we are in a good space in the US. But the question is, what does it all add up to globally? And this figure here shows you, I think, both the good side and the worrying side of the story. If you look at the kind of historical trend that going up from the bottom left up to kind of the top right to 2020 there, you see the growing overall emissions. And Anne highlighted this very effectively in her talk. And then what you see is interesting. So I want to just call your attention to the good news part of this story, which is, again, not enough, but I want to kind of say, look at the two wedges there called INDCs and NDCs. Those are the change in emissions that we have realized already as a result of the Paris architecture being negotiated and then put into place. And again, I was involved way back when in the kind of lead up to US for the first NDC, the joint announcement with US and China way back when. These NDCs did make a difference. They pushed the curve of global emissions down substantially. So what that tells us is that we're doing something right? There's a lot of good things happening. There's a lot of low-cost clean energy deploying. There's a lot of new architecture, infrastructure going in this country and other countries to support low emissions transportation and other kinds of good outcomes for both economy and emissions. So a lot of this stuff is happening. The architecture internationally is working, but like I think Anne said, it's not fast enough, not deep enough yet. So the question is, you see the other part of the story is that those NDCs, those national targets, have not gone far enough down to get us to where we need to be in 2030, 2040, and 2050. And I won't go into some of the sciencey stuff about what do those ranges mean and all that. Happy to talk either in Q&A or even later about those questions. Anne's report will give you a great overview of that, by the way. So ultimately, though, those bands essentially show you that we got to be somewhere in those bands just to kind of keep 2 degrees or 1.5 alive. And we're clearly not there yet. So one of the parts of the outcome is we're not on track yet. Hannah already said that. We're not on track. I like to say we're not on track yet. There's still things we can do. There's still things that are important that we can do, and frankly are not like wildly crazy things for us to imagine doing globally. And for sure, like they're very sensible things that are in line with what we're already doing in the US to get ourselves on that more ambitious track. They're healthy for lots of reasons, and they're also things that deliver on emissions reductions. So we heard about the ambition or the emissions gap and the implementation gap. Just for those of you who are tracking, those are concepts that have emerged in the global stocktake process. One of them, the emissions gap, is essentially, the emissions gap is essentially the difference between the stated goal of a country and the kind of level of emissions they're likely to hit based on what their current policies are. And so, for example, if you have a 50% target like the US, the question is, what does the current policies deliver? I'm going to tell you, we're not on track to get to 50% quite yet. We have to do more, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So that's the emissions gap. Another part of the emissions gap is also what Anne was talking about, the gap between where we are with the targets and where we kind of need to be on track. The implementation gap is more about like, how well we're doing at getting those policies implemented, making sure that, for example, we've got IRA in the US. Are we doing IRA in a sort of maximal climate-friendly way? That's another part of the implementation gap. Okay, let me go to the next slide. And I don't have many slides, by the way. So we'll just, I think I have 3 or 4. So this is directly from the Global Stocktake Technical Dialogue synthesis document. So just to give you a little bit of a cheat sheet on what the findings were. On the left, you see the key findings for the overall stocktake, which I'm not going to spend that much time on since my job is the right-hand side, but just so you have them in your, in your deck that if you want, they're there on the left. The mitigation findings, I think, were what I'll really focus on. But just to kind of recap on the key findings, the Paris Agreement is working in some ways. That's kind of what I highlighted in the last slide. It's important for governments, whether it's our government or others around the world, to integrate climate policy with other types of policies. And of course, we're talking about a rapid transformation that both has positive aspects to it, but also can leave certain people behind. It's important for governments to be aware of, use their domestic processes to make sure that we mind to support equity, inclusion, and to make sure that the benefits are broadly shared. So those are general principles that I think even in the US we also aim for. In terms of mitigation, well, I mentioned the kind of a not in line part in the last slide. Ultimately, these are just, again, these are from the technical dialogue, which is cited at the bottom of the page here. Some of that is similar to the Ann's report, which is sort of saying this is the level that our new NDCs need to get to. There's a number that you hear quoted a lot called 43% by 2030. There is some scientific subtlety to the question of it doesn't have to be exactly 43, but that's about sort of picking something out of a range, but nevertheless something high, above 30 and up to maybe up to 50 even. And then that has to continue to accelerate, which I think Ann's slides did more effectively than my bullets do here, drawing from the report. One other bullet, just I want to kind of note that the two at the bottom, something we're learning increasingly, not only in the US context, which I think we are, but also lots of other countries, is that this is a rapid transformation that is essentially impacting the entire economy and all people within the economy. And so as a result of that, it's really become much more obvious, even though many people have said it correctly for many years, it's becoming more obvious that politically speaking, it's really important to pay attention to the just transitions element of this. Like more robust outcomes, more equitable outcomes are not only good for kind of values reasons, kind of trying to make sure everybody's protected and the benefits are broadly shared, but it's also very important for continuing to provide support for what is a rapid and long-term transition. It's both a sprint and a marathon. So like we have to do both of those things. And to make sure we're doing it, we have to make sure we're doing, to be successful at doing it, we have to make sure we're doing it right, which means that we're listening to, embedding, and sort of supporting that equity dimension and that justice dimension across the board. And then similarly, economic diversification. In the U.S. economy, we're pretty well diversified, but we can always be happy to grow our clean electricity, clean energy, electric vehicle industry, and much more. Other countries do, of course, have to pay attention to that more, especially if they're kind of a more asymmetric economy based on, for example, fossil extraction. Okay, so this is just a slide about sort of implications for all countries. And I think this is really echoing some of the themes that we heard from Ann's presentation, but this is coming out of that global stocktake process formally. As a result of the stocktake, again, we're not on track. The COP is essentially this COP. One of the big themes of this COP is the global stocktake. Are we on track? No, we're not. What do? We have to raise ambition in this next round of NDCs or national targets. And so that's going to be one of the key themes we hear about. That's going to be something that impacts and sort of is focused on all countries. There will be a lot of discussion about, obviously, different countries have different sort of stages in their development. They have different abilities to respond quickly. And so it has to be kind of an integrated story of different countries will have to do as much as they can, but we'll also have to draw from whatever sources of support can be deployed. For example, financial support to help particularly least developed countries, to make that transition. So there will be a lot of focus on this next round of target setting and planning that will affect, that's something the U.S. has to be will be, in fact, very willingly embedded in and internationally as we kind of engage with the international community about what we do next. And so that'll be part of the theme, I'm sure, coming out of this COP. And then the other piece here is that those are in the international space. Those are always linked, right? It's always linked about, look, I'm a developing country, we're doing the best we can, but we need to talk about how our citizens are impacted. And there's an ongoing conversation between the US and, of course, all countries around the world in the multilateral context, with sort of providing the right kind of support for everybody to do the best they can to try to get on this rapid pace that Anne showed us a few minutes ago. So what does it mean for the U.S.? And here's one of my favorite slides. You heard that I had helped lead the writing for the U.S. long-term strategy, which is one of our regular reporting mechanisms under Paris, and that was when I was with Secretary Kerry's team at State. But I think this is a great figure. This is now focusing not from the international, but just getting to the U.S. part of the story here. You see our historical trajectory here all the way up to 2020. And then you see we have a 2020 goal that we had set a while back. We have a 2025 goal, which you can see here, and then a 2030 goal, which you're probably very familiar with, the 50 to 52 number. We've also set a net zero by 2050 goal, which you can see in kind of the dotted line out to 2050. That's the US's current sort of sketch of where it wants to be going in terms of its targets. But we will have to set a more formal 2035 target as part of this next process. And that will be an important moment that clearly the US has been intent on setting a target that is seen as ambitious and achievable, and something we can deliver with actions in our economy from our national government, from Congress and the executive branch, plus from other governments, states, cities, counties, regions, and more, and with support and buy-in from other kinds of non-party stakeholders, such as businesses and investors, as well as communities and many others. So ultimately, we will have to be thinking about that. Now, even now, our current policies don't quite get us to the 50 to 52, so we have to continue to do more on that. Congress, you guys know better than I do, but there are probably some limited opportunities for that, maybe through agriculture, maybe through other things, but to a large extent, I believe that IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law were tremendous and are going to be huge contributors to success overall. Oops, I don't know where that went. There we go. But ultimately, we will need to do more and probably rely on continued actions from executive branch and subnational actors to help get us over the line. I will also flag that the recent statement that we got out of the U.S. and China at Sunnylands was an interesting indicator. It got a little bit of attention, but kind of quiet, of where the U.S. might want to be going with the next stage and the kind of leadership that the U.S. has been exerting on the international stage, meaning getting our domestic side in good order, delivering strongly on achieving an ambitious, an achievable target, but also then working with other countries, even including China, to make sure that we're all doing the best we can for success. So with that in mind, here in this country, we will probably be embarking in the next 2 months to kick off a round of discussions and activities to look at what might be possible for 2035. That will involve a lot of engagement from you all, from the executive branch and others working together to think about what might be possible for 2035. And then I will say one other element that will kind of occasionally probably show up on your radar. I mentioned before this question about the global outcome and how that links to other issues of interest in other countries. One of the key issues of interest in a lot of other countries is what is called finance, which basically means support and investment through places like the World Bank, but also through other kinds of vehicles. And obviously that's a sensitive topic in this country, but one that we absolutely do for global outcomes need to be paying good attention to and need to be delivering on in terms of global success. And I know that that's an ongoing difficult process of having those conversations and thinking through what's possible. But my one, even though I don't work on finance centrally myself, I will say it is very important for us to be paying attention to that question and doing the best we can to provide some kinds of finance, whether it's through JETPs or through World Bank or through bilateral or through other mechanisms, to make sure that other countries have the support they need to also act ambitiously on climate. With that, I'm going to wrap, and we can always return to any of those in Q&A.
Thank you, Nate. Yes, absolutely. We can come back to lots of those. Nate also had great slides in addition to the great slides from our other presenters. So if you'd like to go back and revisit any of those slides, everything is posted on our website at www.eesi.org. You can also find an archived webcast if you want to go back and listen or watch any portion of the briefing as well. You can definitely do that. Also, I'd like to thank everyone who submitted questions online so far. There's still plenty of time to do that. We'll have a Q&A after our fourth panelist. So if you have a question, the best way to send it to us, or maybe I'll say the most popular way to send it to us today, is by sending us an email. And the email address to use is ask, that's ASK, @eesi.org. You can also follow us on social media at EESI Online. Our fourth panelist today is Jeffrey Chi. Jeffrey is a policy advisor with the International Institute for Sustainable Development's Resilience Program. Jeffrey's work focuses on ecosystem-based adaptation, the National Adaptation Plan process, and multilateral environmental negotiations related to climate change adaptation and biodiversity. He has represented environmental NGOs or non-governmental organizations in the UN climate negotiations since 2017. Jeffrey, welcome to the briefing today. Really looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here and echoing Nate to thank EESI for organizing this very important briefing, and thank the other panelists for the amazing summary on what's happening and what needs to be done at both the international level as well as the domestic level. IISD is an international think tank based out of Canada and Geneva, and we work on a range of sustainable development issues from trade to climate change, including UNFCCC negotiations. So I work on adaptation negotiations and the Global Stocktake for IISD and its National Adaptation Plan Global Network, and I was one of the technical experts on adaptation for the Global Stocktake. It's a pleasure to join today and share some of the key findings and implications on adaptation from this first Global Stocktake. I am joining you from Vancouver, Canada, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, and Indigenous peoples around the world are combating the climate crisis, are on the front line of combating the climate crisis. Adaptation is an important part of global climate action, and since the very beginning of the climate process at the international level, I think the conversation has always been a little bit more mitigation focused, and adaptation only recently got the attention it really deserves. So I think it's important to first define what we mean by adaptation inside and outside of those negotiation halls. For me, I think adaptation is fundamentally about protecting people, protecting our communities, safeguarding our economies and our natural heritage in this changing climate. It's about understanding what some of the climate risks, where climate impacts might happen, and what vulnerabilities communities will be facing in this changing climate. And this way, we could prepare for this uncertain future and strengthen resilience to protect people and our biodiversity. And adaptation always starts with understanding the risks and the vulnerabilities associated with climate change. And this is for us to identify adaptation options, such as coastal defense and diking system, resilient infrastructure, amending building codes, setting up early warning systems, and of course, conserving and restoring our natural ecosystems. Coming back to the Global Stocktake, like Hannah and Nate have already mentioned, the Paris Agreement has set very explicit mandates on what the Global Stocktake needs to do in terms of mitigation or on the nationally determined contribution, or NDCs. But it also really gave a set of mandates on adaptation as well. So first, the Global Stocktake needs to recognize the adaptation efforts of developing country parties. Second, it needs to provide recommendations and lessons learned to help countries improve their implementation of adaptation actions. And third, like Hannah has mentioned, the Global Stocktake, of course, has this backward-looking component to review our actions, as well as the supports provided for adaptation, in order to assess our collective progress towards reaching something called the Global Goal on Adaptation, which is enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerabilities to the impacts of climate change. So hopefully through the GST, we will be able to understand where we are in terms of adaptation progress, and how countries could improve both the planning and the implementation of their national adaptation plans and strategies in the next crucial 5 years. So what are some of the kind of key messages from this technical dialogue as well as from this assessment? Similar to the other thematic areas that have been mentioned before, there has been significant progress on adaptation since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. At least 84% of countries, both developing country and developed countries, have at least one adaptation policy instrument at the national level. That could be a national adaptation plan, it's called NAPS, or a national adaptation strategy, or NAS, that's commonly used in developed countries. And most countries include the adaptation actions in their nationally determined contributions. And of course, part of the mandate of the Global Stocktake, we need to recognize the adaptation efforts of developing country parties. Out of the 152 developing country parties, over 140 have a national adaptation planning process underway at a national level. And out of those, 47 have already submitted a national adaptation plan to the United Nations. And this is an incredible demonstration of progress. Considering just a couple of years ago, this number of NAP being submitted to the UN is around a dozen. So now we are close to 50. So there have been significant progress being made over the past few years. But just like Nate has mentioned, there's good news and there's some bad news as well. And it's very clear that we're not on track yet on adaptation. And we will have to acknowledge that most observed adaptation efforts have been fragmented, incremental, sector-specific, and unequally distributed. And adaptation efforts are not on par with the increasing impacts we are witnessing around the world. Even though we have more plans on paper, like those 50 national adaptation plans being submitted, they're not necessarily being implemented in practice to keep up with our changing climate. And with this, some ecosystems have already reached what we call the hard limit to adaptation, meaning that we have run out of options to adapt to global warming and its impacts in some areas of the world. And we are seeing increasing losses and damages associated with climate change impacts around the world, including both here in the US and as well as in Canada. So the window of opportunity to secure a livable future is rapidly closing. And collectively, we need to do more to close this implementation gap and transition from planning into implementation. And one of those is core to those is addressing the soft limits of adaptation, which include things like addressing the lack of adequate finance, technology, and human capacities at both the national as well as the subnational levels. And the Global Stocktake Synthesis Report was very clear on this message that we need to ramp up ambition and support for adaptation in the next decade. And this is crucial to ensure that we have a livable future and we can protect and transform our way of life. Just like what Hannah said before in her kind of overview, the adequate provision of the means of implementation plays an important role in building the capacities and the knowledge to confront the climate crisis. And one message that was heard loud and clear during the technical dialogue was that there is an urgent need to rapidly scale up adaptation finance. In 2020, developed countries have collectively mobilized around 83 billion US dollars of climate finance for developing countries, and finance allocated specifically for mitigation still represents the largest share of that 83 billion at around 57%. And only 28% were earmarked for adaptation, and only 15% were earmarked for actions that address both mitigation and adaptation. So think of something like conserving or restoring forests that could contribute both to emission reduction as well as adaptation. And while these numbers have gone up in the last decade, especially on kind of the share of adaptation finance, they're still quite low relative to the amount of impacts that we are witnessing. particularly in developing countries. And in the global north, the share of investments in resilience building and adaptation as a percentage of total spending on climate action is also still quite small. There really is an urgent need to rapidly scale up adaptation finance, both in terms of domestic spending as well as the provision of international development assistance. And while public support and finance play a crucial role in building capacities for adaptation, we also need to recognize that there's a need to mobilize private sector finance because climate risk is investment risk, and more companies and private sector actors are paying close attention to adaptation and climate risk. Further, access to climate finance in developing countries still needs to be improved, and there are a lot of barriers in accessing these much needed money for adaptation, whether it's through the World Bank or through the Green Climate Funds, through the Adaptation Fund. So there are a lot of different financial mechanisms involved in financing adaptation, but there are still a lot of barriers to access and to entrance for developing countries. And a huge part of that is the need to increase the human capacity to undertake the planning and implementation of adaptation actions. What the Global Stocktake has concluded is that country ownership is fundamental, and we need needs-based approach in adaptation capacity building as well as project implementation. The Global Stocktake also kind of pointed us to some very good practices and lessons learned that's being shared by countries and practitioners over the past year. It has concluded that when adaptation is informed and driven by local context, population, and priorities, both the adequacy and the effectiveness of adaptation and supports are enhanced. So adaptation is the responsibility of all levels of governments, and everyone has a role to play in promoting climate resilient development. And a huge part of that is to try to mainstream adaptation, meaning integrating climate risk considerations in all aspects of decision-making and development planning. In practice, it kind of means thinking about questions like, is the National Guard thinking about climate risk or future climate trajectories when it's planning its emergency preparedness plans? Or is the General Services Administration taking, future climate impacts into account when retrofitting a federal facility? Or does the new economic plan or legislations make sense in this changing climate, and how best we can adapt to this changing climate? And these all require accessible climate services and reliable climate information. Things like historical climate summaries, systematic observation and monitoring of data of weather and climatic patterns, data on natural disaster patterns and changes to natural disaster patterns due to climate change. So these are all very important at both the national level as well as the community level, the subnational level. And lastly, I just want to highlight that the synthesis report really highlighted the need for inclusive planning and implementation. This means paying close attention to things like gender equality and human rights. And I think participatory and inclusive planning processes leads to a more equitable adaptation outcome and the more equitable distribution of adaptation benefits for everyone, regardless of their background, their social background, or their genders. And leaving no one behind. And this also means paying close attention to vulnerable groups like women and girls, people living in rural areas, people with disability, or indigenous peoples or other racial minorities. And perhaps more importantly, to empower these vulnerable groups to be the agents of change and to implement and to include them in the planning and implementation of adaptation actions. So before I kind of end this presentation and hand it back to Daniel, I just want to quickly mention some of the Global Stocktake's implication on adaptation and resilience building in the United States. So just a couple of weeks ago, the fifth National Climate Assessment was released, like Daniel has mentioned at the beginning of this briefing, and it has concluded that climate change is wreaking havoc across the US. And its assessment was that it's way harder to protect people and their properties, to provide reliable public services, and to have sustainable economy and thriving ecosystems and culture. The NCA 5 also mentioned that some states are doing a bit better on preparing for and adapting to climate change than the other, but climate impacts are affecting all 50 states, the DC, as well as the Commonwealth territories. Not always equally, but every part of the US can feel the impacts of climate change. And NCA 5 ended with a call that the US needs strong leadership to create a more resilient and just nation. And I think it's largely in line with what we heard at international level on adaptation progress and what we need to do in the next crucial decade. In 2021, President Biden's executive order 14008 has mandated the preparation of the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Plan annually. Which the first one was implemented last year, and there was a progress report that's being released. And ultimately, I think the US will need to do more in terms of transition from planning on paper into implementation in communities in the different states, and leverage the findings of this global stocktake at the international level to update its adaptation and resilience plan for the next year and for the one for 2025. And just a quick plug that, as Daniel mentioned, EESI has the briefing on NCA 5 in January in 2024. So highly recommend the audience to attend to learn more about this critical assessment in this critical decade. Lastly, internationally, I think we will see this at COP28. There will be a stronger push for the global north to face up its historical responsibilities and its obligation to scale up the mobilization of adaptation finance to developing countries, and most importantly, to deliver the Glasgow commitments to double the amount of adaptation finance provided for developing country by 2025. And so we will see what happens in Dubai on that front. And with that, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity and handing it back to Daniel to kickstart the discussions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeffrey. And brownie points for plugging in EESI upcoming briefing. That's what I like to do, but I always appreciate it when our audience hears from a third party. And I'll return the favor. We featured two of your IISD colleagues recently on a podcast episode of the climate conversation about fossil fuel subsidies. And so Phil Gass and Laura Cameron did a great job for us. If you want to learn more about that issue, really, really great episode. It was really fun to get to talk to Phil and Lauren about that. Our cup overfloweth. We have a ton of questions coming in from our online audience. I'm going to try to get to them, as many as I can. But I do want to revisit one thing at the beginning. I don't want to go too long today, so hopefully we can move through questions pretty quickly. But Hannah, I'd like to come back and start our Q&A with you. And ask you a little bit more about how the U.S. government, but also other U.S. stakeholders have been involved in the global stocktake process over the past couple of years. And then after you have an opportunity, I'd love to hear from Anne and Nate and Jeffrey if they have any things, and we'll dip into the audience questions.
Sure. So I think Nate will also have a good insider view on this because he was in the administration for part of his time there, overlapped with the stocktake. But just to say, very involved. So that 18-month technical assessment period I mentioned, that was led by two people, one nominated essentially by developed countries and one by developing countries. The developed country lead was actually from the US. He works at the US State Department, Farhan Akhtar. And then the developing country lead was Harold Winkler from South Africa. So actually the US State Department, an employee had a big role in managing that entire technical process and then actually authored that synthesis report. So the US was quite involved there. And then in terms of other US stakeholders, so as the IGST, one of our goals is actually to push this out beyond the US and help those in regions that are maybe less typically involved or connected to global climate negotiations to be involved. So we've kind of worked with folks around the globe. But of course, the negotiations are in English. The negotiations are most accessible to people who can get a visa to the countries where they're happening. So there were quite a lot of US stakeholders. So a lot of, I would say this process had unprecedented openness to non-party and civil society input for a UNFCCC process. It was great, and we think it really strengthened the process, and it's not something we've seen in the negotiations quite as much. So yeah, academics, research, work from CGS, IGST, others based in the US was an input into the stocktake and was taken there.
Anne, happy to hear your commentary as well from your perspective, and then we can go to Nate and to Jeffrey.
Yeah, I don't have any particular insights into the US participation, but in general, I would say that there has been quite a lot of engagement and involvement from different stakeholders, including non-state stakeholders and private sector, and that's been really, really amazing to see. But I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think in interest of time, I think Hannah and Ann did a good job. I will just note, yeah, the U.S. State Department was sort of co-leading this process through Farhan, so or the technical dialogue part of the process. So I think we should feel we were very well represented and in the formal part of the process. And I think that in this other part of it is also worth noting that in these international processes, a lot of times they're very like distant feeling and isolated in sort of the foreign ministry space. But in this process, I think they did make some real effort, and I think even had success in opening that up to different kinds of stakeholder inputs from diverse types of organizations, not just NGOs, and advocacy type organizations, but also a diverse set of other types of actors, including businesses and others. So I think there was some broad-based input to that. And then I would also note part of the theory too of the UN system as we've set it up with the Paris Agreement is a lot of stuff does still go through national political systems. And so just by virtue of our doing the work to kind of do the, laws coming out of Congress and the executive actions and whatnot, to some degree, those are part of the overall process by design. So our consultation should be seen as including those things as well.
Jeffrey, any thoughts from you? Happy to give you
Sure. Yeah, just complementing what Other has already mentioned, I think there's a diverse range of actors, but also a diverse range of methods to the technical dialogue. We've seen kind of the work cafe tables where people are less formal and more informal, and we can see negotiators really kind of take off their negotiator hat and stop reading prepared statements and to really get into deep end in terms of what are the lessons learned, what are the best practices they can share with their colleagues from around the world. So that's very heartwarming to see, and it's a very informative process as well.
That was great. Thank you very much. So this question comes to us from the online audience. So it's a free-for-all. Anyone's welcome to chime in, and I'll take you unmuting yourself as a cue that you have something that you would like to say. And it reminds me, Hannah, I think it was your slide where you had sort of a timeline chart, and there was the technical period that you made a point that was not a negotiated document. It was a technical document, but ultimately, there's technical stuff that happens, right? But it's a set of political decisions, right, of different parties coming together and agreeing on what they can agree on. And Global Stocktake will absolutely be one of those big things and maybe the biggest agenda item. But there'll be other agenda items as well. And this person wrote us a question about how other potentially politically controversial agenda items, the one they used was fossil fuel phase out. But I could imagine that other politically controversial ones, like perhaps loss and damage and others. How could progress on the Global Stocktake affect some of these other sort of dynamics or these other politically controversial topics that other stakeholders really, really want to have addressed? And again, this is open for anyone who might have some commentary about this. So I'll turn it over to you all.
I hate to jump in first again, but maybe I'll just jump in. So there certainly will be interplay, and I think that's a recognized piece of the stocktake, is it does touch all these other agenda items that are happening. Something like the fossil fuel phase out, I mean, that could land in the stocktake itself. So the entire premise of the stocktake is we did this technical exercise to see, and one thing I'll actually note about that technical exercise is the reason it's unique and important is because it is mandated as part of the Paris Agreement. So there are all these other really important and great assessments, and those feed into the stocktake, but the legitimacy, at least in the eyes of the negotiators and the folks who are creating this final text, the legitimacy of the stocktake is that it was mandated as part of the Paris Agreement and it's happening within this negotiated framework. And so that's an important piece of it. So the technical results tell us, we have so many years left before we've reached 1.5. We cannot do any more oil and gas expansion. And so then the onus is on the negotiators to take those lessons and put them into the final GST negotiated text. So I mean, we'll see what the actual prospects for something like phase out are this year, but the GST decision itself would be somewhere that could actually land. So that could be a piece of the final decision in that negotiated text. Things like the loss and damage fund, I know Jeffrey or Anne or Nate might know more on this, but certainly I think that will be acknowledged in the GST text, but that does kind of have a separate track, but all those things are going to be interplaying across the 2 weeks and kind of a give and take of what lands where.
Go ahead, Anne, please.
Thanks. No, just on the fossil fuel phase out or phase down, I think a lot of people are expecting there to be much discussion around that, and especially around how it will be couched in the text. So last year, at the COP last year, all of a sudden the suggestion from India came up to expand, because right now in the COP decision text, we only have phase down of coal, unabated coal, maybe even. And now there's, I think, an expectation that it will at least be broadened to cover all fossil fuels. Also because only mentioning or singling out coal puts more heavy focus on many of the large developing countries that are very reliant on coal. And I think one way of couching it could also be to link it to the other targets that are under discussion, such as doubling energy efficiency and tripling renewable by 2030. So I think that there's going to be this focus on positive things or solution side, but we also need to focus on what really has to happen, which is rapid decarbonization if we want to keep the Paris temperature goal alive.
And Nate and Jeffrey, please feel free to jump in with anything. Otherwise, I'll move on. So this next question also comes to us from our online audience, and it's related to one that we were talking about before the briefing got started today. And that is that after COP28, the next global stocktake process will begin, more or less, right? Like this is something that is cyclical. We've talked about that in your presentations. Nate, maybe this one would be a good one to start with you on, and that is like, what does the global stocktake process look like going forward post COP28? And from someone in our online audience, this person was interested in, like, what does it actually look like? Is it a text? Is it part of the cover decision? How will people who want to follow this sort of going forward be able to follow the actual sort of outcomes from the global stocktake at COP28?
Yeah, I'll do a real quick one on this, but invite my fellow panelists to also jump in because I think all of them have expertise. Real quick, what does it look like? I think going forward, maybe I'll tackle that real quick, which is, right now we got this stocktake. We're going to have a big discussion around this stocktake, this COP, and there's going to be some discussion about, is it forward-looking? And, we heard a little bit about that. So the point being, like, how do we think about how this connects to the NDC cycle? That will be a big story. I think that will be a part. It won't be the only story. The fossil phase out may end up being more visible story, but at the core, this is an important story of the COP. So we'll see that. I do think that realistically, what's going to happen is we're going to then be focusing on the NDC construction over the next couple of years as part of the Paris architecture. And I don't think there's going to be a lot of like stocktake related activity per se from the formal part of the Paris Agreement stuff, right? There will continue to be a whole bunch of other scientific inquiry into, are we on track or not, that will be valuable and worth following, including, but not limited to, Anne's type of work happening out of UNEP and whatnot. But there's lots of other science happening on that. We'll have to continue to track that. Governments around the world will be continuing to track that. And then the stocktake itself will start to kind of crank up in a couple of years, I think, as Hannah kind of indicated. So there'll be kind of a lull in the formal process, but basically we're stocktaking every year. I think that's important to remember. Like, really, we need to take stock every year. All countries need to be thinking, can we do more? Are we doing enough? What more can we do?
Sure, I'll go. I'll just kind of complement what Nate has mentioned before. In order to kind of really to have that follow up for the next 5 years, because the next Global Stocktake will start in 2020 or conclude in 2027. So for the next 5 years, there needs to be kind of this decision that needs to be made at COP28 to how can countries better follow up on the key findings of the Global Stocktake. So in terms of COP28, it will be the first decision of the governing body of the Paris Agreement, the CMA. So Global Stocktake decision will be Decision 1 CMA 5. There will not be like a cover decision like last year. That's at least from what we've heard so far from the presidency, but that might change, very well might change in the next couple of weeks. But Global Stocktake is the cover decision this year, and it will kind of cover all of these thematic areas that the panelists have covered today. And I think two things are critical for this decision, and one is to provide that follow-up. What countries need to do in terms of updating their NDCs, but also other climate policy instruments like their national adaptation plans or strategies. And second is to provide a signal on the next Global Stocktake. What needs to be improved, what could be improved, what needs to be done in order to prepare for the next one to start. Because the next one, the process will start in 2026 and conclude in 2027. So it's very important to provide that signal as well.
Hannah or Anne, happy to give either of you the last word if there's anything else that you would like to offer. Okay. Well, unfortunately, that brings us to 3:30. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of our questions from our online audience. There were just too many, but I really appreciate everyone writing in, and we'll take a look at them. And if there's any way that we can send follow-ups, we will do our best to do that. But really, really great presentations today. Hannah, Anne, Nate, and Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us, teaching us all about the Global Stocktake and what's to come. Really, really appreciate your presentations. You put a lot of work into them, and if anyone in our online audience would like to go back and revisit them, everything will be posted online on our website, www.eesi.org. And that includes presentation materials, and eventually they will also have summary notes, so you won't have to, you should go back and rewatch the briefing, but you won't have to eventually. You can just scan them, and that way you can get to those key points. But thanks so much for being excellent panelists for us today. I'd also like to say special thanks to Representative Castor, who joined us with some virtual remarks. Always a pleasure to work with your office, Representative Castor. Thanks to your great staff for making your participation possible. Thank you very much for that. This is on this slide is just an overview of our briefings to date. So this is the third of our COP series. First one was about international climate finance. The second one was on the what's on the table for the negotiations. And then today, Global Stocktake. This is also the link you can use to sign up for our daily newsletter, COP Dispatch. We're not trying to recreate like mainstream media coverage of COP. We really do try to look at things from a US policymaker focus or perspective, and especially a member of Congress perspective or their staff's perspective. So it's a really great complementary resource to other newsletters that you might already be getting. I tend to think ours is sort of, I think it's S tier as far as newsletters go. I hope no one misses it. But I hope everyone signs up for that. I'd also like to say special thanks to my colleagues who made today's briefing possible. That includes Dan O, Omri, Allison, Anna, Molly, and Nicole. We also have really tremendous interns this semester, Zoe, Laura, and Maggie. So thanks to everything that they've done in the lead up as well, and will do as we work through some of the follow-up materials. Anna, one of the people I mentioned, Anna McGinn, and I will be at COP. We leave tomorrow, and we'll be there for the entire first week, and then our COP coverage will continue from DC. But it takes a village to put this COP stuff together. But if you are going to be in COP and you're in our online audience, feel free to shoot Anna or me an email. All of our contact information is listed on the webpage if you'd like to meet up, or if you have any questions about our coverage, we'll be happy to answer you. Last thing, this once again is our survey link. If you have a moment to take our survey, we really read every response. If there's feedback that you have about the programming, if you have ideas for future programming, please let us know. It's been a little while since we've done an online only briefing. I think the last one was in September. So if we're rusty, you can let us know. If it was the best briefing you've ever seen, definitely let us know. And we'll be really appreciative of any responses. This will do it for our briefings. We will have our UN side event coming up on science behind carbon markets. You can learn all about our other COP resources online, but we'll be back on January 18th, 2024 for our next congressional briefing, which will be focused on the 5th National Climate Assessment. So you won't want to miss that. Thanks, everybody. Hope you all had a great holiday last week. Thanks for joining us on a busy Monday, and we'll go ahead and end it there. Thanks so much.